Welcome to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. You've heard people talk about a will and mention the importance of an executor. But what exactly is an executor and what do they do? Now, when you speak with someone who has been in that role, they will tell you that it is more than stressful and it's harder than they actually originally thought it would be, especially if the deceased leaves them with a lot of vague or incomplete requests. So, can executors be held liable for any mistakes that are made and be held accountable for personal financial risk? The answer is yes. To help us understand the important role of an executor, I'm joined by Cheryl Maloney, a Certified Executor Advisor at Caldwell Securities Ltd. Cheryl, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Liz.
So I know that you're really passionate about this. I want to begin with, how did you become so interested in helping executors?
Well, becoming a Certified Executor Advisor was never on my radar. It was actually a life event that put me down the path to getting my CEA designation. My mother had quite a bad health scare about 8 years ago, and I had agreed to be the executor for both my parents' wills. And it was something that I wasn't expecting, and it really threw me off, thinking that, wow, this job could happen a lot sooner than I'd ever expected. Mm-hmm. So it was a real wake-up call for me. I had agreed to be executor. I had no idea what that entailed, what duties would be required of me. So I actually looked up this designation and took it for my own personal knowledge, and then realized there are so many other people out there just like me who are in the same boat. So now I'm really passionate about sharing this knowledge with others and helping other executors be successful.
Well, that's amazing, and that's why you're here today. So let's begin with what specifically is an executor?
So an executor, otherwise known as an estate trustee or estate administrator, is someone who's named in a will who will make sure that the instructions in the will are properly followed. And historically, this has been seen as a position of, honor and duty. And for most people who are asked, they do feel a duty to agree to accept the role when they're asked to do that. But when you think of 90% of the Canadians out there, they're going to be asking a family member or friend to be their executor.
Or somebody that they trust.
Absolutely.
So what does an executor do?
Lots of different duties, but let's see if I can group them into different groups for you. So one would be first maybe arranging the funeral. They'd need to obtain a probated will. They're definitely in charge of securing and collecting all the assets of the estate and also protecting and managing those assets. If there's any liabilities for the estate to pay, they'll do that, and any receivables they need to collect. They need to verify any claims against the estate, and also, of course, distribute assets to beneficiaries. They're in charge of making sure a final tax return is done, and also they have to do their own accounting of their role as executor.
Okay, so given all these tasks, how long does it usually take to settle an estate?
Well, it all depends. So, for example, if the estate is really complex, it can take over 5 years to settle an estate, depending where the assets are located and what type of assets they are. But generally, a typical estate would take a year to a year and a half to settle. And that would equate to, let's say, 500 to 600 hours of effort.
Wow.
So that's a big commitment for an executor.
The other thing, too, is a lot of people think, I'm just going to put somebody's name down as an executor because I know that certain members of my family were just told, just put a name down. You just need to put a name down, not thinking of the amount of work that has to go into it, how serious this is. And the other thing is the person actually has to live near you or within your vicinity and not keep, having to fly back and forth from province to province or country to country.
Mm-hmm. Well, it definitely makes sense. I mean, it's certainly easier to be an executor if you live in that area. And it's important to choose the right person. And the next thing an executor should really do is sit down with the testator, and that's the person whose will it is, to go through what's in the will. You don't want any surprises when the person's no longer there to ask a question to.
So we're just going to go to commercial break right now, but when we come back, we're going to delve more into the executor liabilities, the fiduciary duty, and everything else. Because I know this is a very important topic, and I think everybody needs to understand exactly what an executor does and how important this role is. So don't go away. We'll be right back with more of Cheryl and just deciding and understanding what executors are. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. On today's episode, we're discussing the important role of being an executor. And so, Cheryl, I want to ask you, why is the executor role it's so intense and so hard to do? Because a lot of people think, oh, okay, I'll do it. And they don't put a lot of thought process into what exactly they're doing. Because whenever you talk to anyone who's done the role, you hear that it was a lot more stressful, a lot more involved, and took a lot longer than they originally thought.
Well, an executor role is a fiduciary duty, and a fiduciary duty carries a much higher standard of conduct and care because you are actually dealing with the management and distribution of money that belongs to another person, another party. So you're held to a much higher standard of conduct and care, and you are expected to act in a more, if you want to call it, professional manner than you would for your own personal business.
So basically, fiduciary duty, you've got to put the will, the deceased, and the role of being an executor first, over and above anything else.
Absolutely. They don't care how busy you are at work. If you're working full time, have a lot of demands on your plate, the moment that job starts, that's your number one. And that's the one thing that the courts will really make you stick to is you have to stick to their timelines and meet those deadlines, or that's not going to be a good day for the executor.
So when do all the responsibilities kick in as an executor?
So when you start doing your very first duty, so let's use an example. Let's say you're the executor for person A and person A passes away. So the moment you step into that role is the moment you do something on behalf of that deceased person. So then the clock starts ticking and you become the executor. And that's when your duties start. So in a lot of cases, it is the executor stepping in to arrange the funeral. And as soon as they start to do something like that, their role starts.
So who is the executor responsible to?
Well, the executor is personally responsible for his or her actions to beneficiaries and creditors in relation to investment losses or breaches of trust. And they're also responsible to other parties who have dealings with the deceased, such as contractual obligations or wrongs in law.
So let's just talk about the role a little bit more. You talked about, paying taxes for the deceased. I think a lot of people don't even think that when somebody is deceased, they still had to pay their taxes for whatever amount the year that they were alive still. Mm-hmm. And there's bill paying, and there's so much more involved than just, handing out money or yes, dividing up whatever the deceased wanted so-and-so to have, or, mm-hmm, or children or whatever.
Well, there's so many balls in the air when you think about it. The executor has so many tasks to do. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but the role can equate to 90 to 100 individual tasks that they have to complete in that time period. And there are deadlines with regards to that. And also for the executor, they have to stick to those deadlines. Like it's extremely important to meet them, so there's no CRA issues or issues with the Ministry of Finance.
So what are some common issues that you see people, like when somebody's planning their estates, what are some common issues that are forgotten or are not included to make an executor's life really, really difficult?
Well, one thing would be to make sure that your wishes are properly listed in your will. Verbal contracts can be an issue. If you say one thing, but something else is in your will, that could pose a really big problem for your executor. Another thing is setting your executor up for success. We think about wills and powers of attorney, but you don't want your executor to walk into your home and have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out what bank do you deal with? Where's your investment advisor? Who's your lawyer? Like they have to search through everything. If you don't leave them a roadmap for success, they're going to have some difficulty.
Okay, so we've got a minute before we go to commercial break. Why do executors get sued?
Well, there's lots of reasons, and mainly it could be because of an error that an executor made, or if a beneficiary thinks an executor has made an error. So let's think of some things like perceived favoritism, could be one. Maybe the beneficiary think there's a conflict of interest with the executor. One could be errors in valuation. So think of a painting on grandma's wall. Maybe somebody put it out in a garage sale and not thinking of much, and then somebody comes 2 weeks later and says, where are those group of 7 paintings that were on grandma's wall? That could be a bad day for the executor.
So when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about pressure to settle and everything else, more executor duties and why it's really, really important. So please don't go away. If you're an executor, this is a must-watch episode because you don't want to misstep. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Today's episode, we're discussing the important role of being an executor. So Cheryl, I want to go back to the fiduciary duty. I know we touched upon it a little bit, but I think this is really important. Because an executor is a fiduciary, does that mean that they should also manage assets themselves?
Well, it seems to be a growing trend that a lot of people are opting for a do-it-yourself kind of mentality. And in order to kind of avoid commissions for things like real estate or financial investments. But do-it-yourself activities can lead the estate down the path of really giving up their statutory consumer protection, which is part of law when you use a licensed advisor or real estate agent. So you're really putting the estate at risk for liability issues pertaining to those activities. So think of things that could happen and go wrong if you don't use a licensed real estate agent, for example, in selling a home.
Yeah, so I mean, that's really important. This is a large role. It's a huge role for someone. And quite frankly, you are representing someone who's deceased. So you can't just start making decisions on your own. You've got to follow that pattern.
Right.
I want to talk about charities as well. More and more people are deciding to leave bequests to charities in their wills. Does it make it easier for executors to administer the estate this way?
Well, with today's governance with regards to charities are not taking a back seat anymore. They're not sitting back and just waiting for that bequest to come their way. They're being much more diligent in their review of executor performance. And they're not being very forgiving for any mistakes, especially if it affects their financial well-being. Mm-hmm. So there can be cases where charities are becoming professional beneficiaries. They call themselves professional beneficiaries. And they'll also take executors to court if they feel that it's going to help them in their financial result. So that's something that executors need to be aware of.
That's important. That's an important piece of information. So I know that some executors feel pressure to settle because, there's people that want a payout. Everybody is at them. Everybody is after them to make sure that let's get the money out. Let's get this out as quickly as possible. So there is a pressure to settle the estates quickly. Are there issues with doing that for an executor?
Absolutely. So if you give away assets too quickly, the beneficiaries have no need to actually give you that money back. There's no obligation for them to give that back to you. So if there's a shortfall in the estate, let's say, let's use an example that the executor gave a lot of early distributions to beneficiaries, and all of a sudden CRA came back and said, well, guess what? We've reassessed the estate and you owe more taxes. If there's not enough residual left in the estate, the executor will be on the hook for paying that balance because the beneficiaries are under no obligation to give anything back, whether they want to or are unable to.
So once it has been given out, there's no recourse. You can't just take it back again and say, oh, there's an error, we've got to pay more bills, and we've got higher taxes than we had anticipated.
Yeah. You simply hope that the beneficiaries will give something back, but they're not obligated to.
Okay, so what are some things executors or testators should do to make sure that estates and wills are in order?
Well, as I mentioned before, make sure that you definitely choose the right executor for the job. And it's really important that testator and executor sit down together and go through the will together, because there may be ambiguities or questions that the executor has, and the only time they can get answers is when that testator is still alive. So let me give you an example. There's an actual case of a very poorly worded will that went to court. And there was a woman who had 3 primary beneficiaries and 19 nieces and nephews
Wow.
listed in her will. And in her will, it said she wanted to leave $25,000 to her 19 nieces and nephews. Now, if you're the executor, are you thinking, wow, is that $25,000 each or $25,000 divided by 19? So you can guess that each party had a different opinion, and that's a material difference. That's $450,000 difference. So of course this went to court. And if the executor had read the will beforehand, they would have an opportunity to ask a question.
Okay, so we're getting ready to go to commercial break one more time, and then we'll have the last segment. I'm wondering if you can think of some really good situations that people can relate to so that they understand the importance of being an executor and the importance of putting a proper will together. Because a lot of people think, I'll do it myself, I'll write this up, I'll have somebody, look after it. And when I'm dead, when I die, it doesn't really matter because I'm not going to be around. Somebody else can deal with it. So think of some interesting stories that we can share with the viewers so that it'll resonate with them. So when we come back, they'll be able to understand how important this is. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Today's episode, we're discussing the important role of being an executor. I'm joined by Cheryl Maloney, a Certified Executor Advisor at Caldwell Securities Ltd. So Cheryl, I want to talk about the importance of a will. Why is it important to have a will?
Well, if you don't have a will, then one, you cannot name an executor. And if you don't have a will, your assets are going to be distributed according to a government formula. And it may not go to the people you'd like it to go to, or for those in your family that you need it to go to. So having a will is extremely important.
So let's talk, we talked about everyday examples. Can you talk about an everyday example of protecting the assets of the estate?
So when I talk about this in my seminars, I'll ask the audience, who here has a key to their parents' home? Or who here is given a key to their adult children for their home? And virtually everybody raises their hand.
Right.
So I share an example of why it's important for an executor to protect and secure the assets of the estate. So again, this is a true case where there was a mom who had a modest estate. She had 3 daughters, and she named the eldest as the executor. So when she passed away, before she passed away, she went around the house and stuck sticky notes on the back of everything. Blue for the eldest, yellow for the middle child, and pink for the baby. So as she's going through and doing all that, everybody in the family knows what their color code is.
Right.
So after mom passes away, the youngest daughter says to her older sister, she says, I want to go get my stuff. She says, well, you have a key to mom's house. Why don't you go in and get everything that's labeled pink? That's yours. So she goes in, does that. And then 2 days later, the middle sister goes in and phones her executor sister and says, where are my things? I'm promised mom's silver tea set. She goes, well, your stuff is marked in yellow. And she said, well, there's nothing here. The youngest sister went in and took absolutely everything in the house.
Wow.
And guess what? The middle sister sued for that silver tea set. She didn't sue her younger sister who took it. She sued the executor who was responsible for protecting the assets.
So that's a very important story to resonate with everyone because families run on trust.
Yes.
Or they're supposed to run on trust. I have a key to your house, you have a key to my house. You can come and go as you please. I can come and go as I please. But you would never think that I would go in and take everything, and I would never think that you would do the same thing. So yeah, the job of the executor with that specific example is very, very important.
And you don't think of it, you don't want to offend anybody, but one thing you should do as an executor is change the locks. So anyone with a key will not have unsupervised access.
A great idea. So you shared this important piece of information with us. What is it that you do as part of your practice?
So I first start with clients by doing a comprehensive review on specific areas of concern. So areas that can trigger potential legal and administrative issues for an executor. So we look at those things. And then we do a list of assets, properties, businesses, this inventory list that the executor can work with. We also look at clarifying what the final wishes are. We can look at, if we have identified any gaps, we certainly will create a roadmap to fix those. And also key information. So information that the executor is going to need, like the passport number, all the things that you have in your wallet, for example, that they're going to have to cancel. So we create a list for the executor to work with. And then if there is no will, by chance, if the client does not have a will, we'll sit down and talk about specific requests and gather all the information that they can take to an estate lawyer to get their will done. And lastly, and probably one of the most important things, is I try to facilitate communication between the testator, the executor, and the beneficiaries, if possible, so that everyone's on the same page when it comes to intergenerational legacy plans.
So communication is key.
Oh, yeah.
There are two things that I think are extremely important. Number one, if you have a pet, make sure that you have somebody that'll take care of your pet when you pass.
Yes.
The other thing too is with social media, we need to be able to share our passwords so that if you are taking care of the deceased social media, you're going to have to be able to close those down and make sure that their legacy is protected. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us today, Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Liz.
As Cheryl mentioned, an executor is an estate administrator who will make sure that the instructions in the will are properly followed. The executor is personally liable for the actions to the following groups or individuals: beneficiaries and creditors for investment losses and breaches of trust that they have a personal financial risk. This is an important job. Essentially, you are following through on the wishes of the deceased, and there is no room for error. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski, and I'm here to empower you and make frugality fashionable. Bye for now.